picture a kid, right? Growing up in a house that is completely devoid of running water.
Right.
Like literally no indoor plumbing. And he's a pretty mediocre student who genuinely prefers, acting in small-town school plays over studying, say, the basic principles of economics.
Yeah, just a regular kid.
Exactly. But now, fast forward a few decades, picture that exact same kid sitting behind the Resolute Desk in the Oval Office, single-handedly rewriting the economic code of the free world.
It is wild.
It is. And, staring down a nuclear-armed Soviet Union across a geopolitical chessboard. I mean, it sounds completely fabricated.
Totally. It sounds like a Hollywood script that would get tossed out for being just way too implausible.
Right, but it actually happened.
It did happen. And I think to understand how we get from point A to point B, you really have to look past the mythology.
Yeah.
You have to dig into the actual mechanics of his life and his era. We have to dissect the machinery of how a person transforms from this completely unknown, impoverished Midwestern kid into this massive ideological monument.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are turning our absolute full attention to one of the most fascinating, polarizing, and genuinely cinematic trajectories in modern history.
Which is, of course, the life, the policies, and the legacy of Ronald Reagan, the 40th president of the United States.
Right. And our guiding light for this exploration today is a highly detailed documentary transcript from a YouTube channel called DocuReal. Specifically, it's a video titled, "This Actor Became President." Really?
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive look at things.
It really is. And our mission for you, the listener, is to basically explore the how and the why. Like, how did an actor fundamentally change American conservatism?
And why did his specific communication style completely reshape global diplomacy?
Exactly. And, how did he entirely rewrite the playbook for the modern presidency?
It's a massive undertaking, but the filmmakers lay out a very specific roadmap for us.
Yeah, they do.
They connect the psychological environment of his earliest days directly to his Hollywood training, and then they trace how those specific experiences really forged the policies that defined the 1980s.
Now, before we get into the weeds here, I need to put my journalist hat on for just a second.
Fair enough.
Because the source material we are examining today wades into some incredibly charged political territory.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we're going to be breaking down the mechanics of Reaganomics, the restructuring of the social safety net, the escalation of the Cold War, and the handling of the AIDS epidemic.
All very heavy topics.
Very heavy. And as a journalist, I know these are topics that still spark really intense, fiery debate today. So I just want to be crystal clear with you, the listener. We are not here to take a political side.
Right, neither left nor right.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly to impartially map out the narrative, the facts, and the specific historical critique exactly as it's presented in this DocuReal documentary.
Yeah, we are just laying their arguments out on the table.
So you can analyze the underlying logic for yourself.
That's the perfect framework, honestly. Our job isn't to judge the history, it's just to explain the mechanics of it according to our source.
So let's start with the origin story. The filmmakers insist that to understand the man who would become the great communicator, we really have to understand the profound instability that forged him.
Right. He was born on February 6, 1911, in Tampico, Illinois. And he was literally born in a commercial building.
Wow.
Yeah. The defining feature of his early childhood wasn't privilege at all. It was just transient poverty.
Because his father was a shoe salesman.
Exactly. Which meant the family was constantly uprooted. They were moving from town to town.
And the documentary highlights that staggering detail we mentioned earlier. They were so poor that for a huge chunk of his childhood, they simply did not have indoor plumbing or running water.
And what's fascinating here is how that physical poverty was compounded by deep emotional instability.
Yeah, the home life.
Right. The documentary paints a picture of a very turbulent home life. His father wasn't just struggling financially, he was a severe alcoholic.
Which the source describes as a very difficult and unpredictable presence.
But then you have this immediate contrast with his mother. The documentary describes her as an incredibly sweet, generous, and devout woman who would actually frequently visit inmates at local prisons.
Oh, wow. As a parent of two myself, my mind immediately goes to the psychological coping mechanisms a kid has to develop in that kind of environment.
Absolutely.
I mean, when you don't have basic physical necessities like water, and your primary male role model is incredibly unpredictable due to addiction, You learn survival skills.
You really do.
You learn hypervigilance. You learn how to read the emotional temperature of a room the literal second you walk into it, because your safety might actually depend on it.
Right. You learn how to placate, how to charm, how to manage volatile personalities.
And that is precisely the psychological foundation the documentary lays out. Those survival skills are the very earliest iterations of his political instincts.
Yeah, and when the family finally settles down a bit in Dixon, Illinois, he finds a productive outlet for those skills. He throws himself into high school drama and football.
He learns that performance, whether it's executing a play on the gridiron or delivering a monologue on a stage, it provides structure.
Structure, praise, and a way to control the narrative around him.
Which brings us to a really compelling juxtaposition the source focuses on. During his time at Eureka College, he majors in economics and sociology.
Right.
But the documentary makes a very specific point to note that he was, by all academic metrics, a deeply mediocre student.
Yeah, he barely scraped by in his economics classes.
But at the same time, he was an absolute superstar when it came to campus politics, student government, and the drama society.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the documentary is making a crucial argument here. His real education wasn't happening in the lecture halls.
No, not at all.
He wasn't absorbing the nuanced mathematical formulas of macroeconomic theory. He was learning human behavior.
He was learning how to build a social coalition.
Exactly. How to persuade a group of his peers, how to deliver a message that resonated emotionally. He was figuring out that facts and figures rarely move crowds.
But a well-told story almost always does.
Right.
But I want to push back on that slightly, or at least play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay, go for it.
A lot of politicians are charismatic, right? But they don't all go on to redefine a century. So what took those raw campus politics skills and honed them into a weapon?
Well, the documentary argues it was his specific postgraduate experience, which happened to be the Hollywood studio system.
Right, he starts as a sports announcer, right?
Yeah, in the Midwest. And then he essentially just talks his way into a screen test with Warner Brothers out in Los Angeles.
And they sign him.
They sign him to a contract for $200 a week. And he doesn't just make a couple of movies, he makes over 50 films.
Yeah, titles like Love is in the Air and Brother Rat.
And famously, he plays the doomed football player George Gipp in that Newt Rockne biopic.
Right, where he delivers the line that literally becomes his lifelong political slogan.
Win one for the Gipper.
Exactly. But the source explicitly points out that he wasn't considered a generational acting talent.
No, not at all.
He wasn't some critical darling winning Academy Awards.
And that is actually the key to understanding his later success. Because he wasn't a tortured artistic genius, he approached acting as a trade.
Hollywood was his masterclass in mass communication.
Exactly. He learned the physical mechanics of production. He learned how lighting changes the mood of a room.
How camera angles can make a person look imposing or approachable.
And most importantly, how a script is structured to elicit a specific emotional response from an audience. He spent decades studying how to make an audience feel something on cue.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because as a journalist, I frequently hear this retroactive label thrown around, Reagan, the Hollywood elite.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
But the documentary meticulously dismantles that idea. He wasn't born into an East Coast aristocracy.
Right.
He was a working-class kid from the rural Midwest who basically used the film industry as a blue-collar trade to pull himself out of poverty.
And while he was building this career, his personal life was experiencing these intense highs and really devastating lows.
Yeah.
In 1938, he marries actress Jane Wyman. They have 2 children, Maureen and Michael. But the documentary includes a detail that profoundly humanizes him.
They had another daughter, Christine.
Yeah, and she died just 1 day after she was born.
Oh, man. Again, speaking as a parent, that is an unimaginable, paralyzing tragedy.
It really is.
It stops you cold. It's this stark reminder that behind the historical monument, there is a very real human being who experienced the deepest kind of grief.
Yeah, and the marriage to Wyman eventually collapses. They divorce in 1949.
But then, the way he meets his second wife, Nancy Davis, it feels so symbolic of the era they were living in.
It really does. It's the late 1940s, the dawn of the Red Scare. Nancy Davis, who's a young actress, is absolutely terrified.
Why?
Because her name has mysteriously appeared on a publicized list of communist sympathizers.
Right. And Reagan at this time is the president of the Screen Actors Guild.
The labor union for actors, yeah. So she reaches out to him for help.
He investigates it, and he realizes there is actually another actress named Nancy Davis who was the real target of the list.
So he uses his union influence to clear her name.
They marry in 1952, and as the documentary notes, she would become one of his most fiercely protective advisors and honestly one of the most influential first ladies in American history.
Absolutely.
But the circumstances of their meeting, the fear of a communist blacklist, that's the perfect segue into what I think is the most mind-bending ideological pivot in the entire documentary.
Yeah. You're talking about his transformation from a New Deal Democrat to a conservative icon.
Exactly. Because here's where it gets really interesting. The documentary explicitly points out that as a young man, Reagan was a staunch vocal liberal.
He idolized Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yes. He supported the New Deal, which was the biggest expansion of government social programs in American history.
And crucially, he was the president of a major labor union.
Right, the Screen Actors Guild. So how on earth does a liberal union boss transform into the patron saint of small government, anti-union conservatism?
It seems like complete cognitive dissonance.
It really does.
But the documentary meticulously explains the mechanics of this shift. It happened in the crucible of Hollywood during the late 40s and 50s.
An era defined by McCarthyism.
Exactly. And the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC.
Okay, I want to slow down here. Because from a media and journalism standpoint, the mechanics of the HUAC era are absolutely chilling.
They are.
And we need to understand exactly how it worked. It wasn't just some vague cultural fear. It was an institutionalized witch hunt.
Right. So HUAC was an investigative committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. Their stated goal was to uncover citizens with Nazi or communist ties.
But in the late 40s, they turned their full glaring spotlight on Hollywood.
They believed that communists were infiltrating the film industry to embed subversive, anti-American propaganda into movies.
And the mechanism they used was fear, just the threat of total economic ruin.
Yeah, the documentary describes how lists of suspected communists were simply published.
If you were subpoenaed by HUA, you are asked that famous question, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
And if you refused to answer, or if you pleaded the Fifth Amendment,
the studio bosses, who were terrified of government regulation and public boycotts, would instantly fire you.
You were blacklisted.
You could not get a job in your own industry. Your career was over overnight.
And right in the middle of this boiling pauldron of paranoia is Ronald Reagan, the president of the Screen Actors Guild.
Navigating these massive, incredibly bitter strikes by rival Hollywood unions.
The studios are losing money, production is halting, and violence is actually occasionally breaking out on the picket lines.
Wait, explain that to me. If he's a union president, shouldn't he be allied with the striking workers?
You would think so.
Right. So why is he viewing them as the enemy?
Because of the ideological framing he adopted during this specific crisis. The documentary explains that Reagan became utterly convinced that these specific strikes weren't organic labor disputes about wages.
Okay.
He believed they were orchestrated by covert communist operatives trying to cripple the American film industry.
And by extension, American cultural output.
Exactly. He became incredibly suspicious of his own peers.
And he didn't just harbor suspicions. He acted on them. The source confirms that he actively cooperated with the FBI as an informant.
Yeah.
In 1947, he actually testified before HUAC as a friendly witness.
Yeah.
And during this process, he named names.
He designated several creatives within the industry as communist sympathizers,
which directly fed into the blacklist that destroyed their careers.
This raises an important question, though. What was happening internally to his political philosophy during all this?
Right.
The documentary argues that this era fundamentally broke his belief in collectivism. He looked at the aggressive labor unions, he looked at the perceived communist threat, and he began to conflate them.
So he started to view unions and the government apparatus that empowered them not as protectors of the working class,
but as tyrannical bureaucracies that stifled individual freedom and made it impossible for businesses to function.
So he essentially flips the script. Instead of the union protecting the individual from the greedy corporation, he starts believing that the corporation and the individual need protection from the overreaching union and the overreaching government.
Precisely. The source explicitly states that during this period he solidified a core philosophical belief.
Which is?
That government intervention doesn't help businesses or individuals. It actively infringes upon their rights.
Wow.
This is the exact psychological bedrock being poured for the conservative movement he would later champion.
And he formalizes this shift publicly in 1962. He completely severs ties with the Democratic Party and registers as a Republican.
And the documentary includes a quote here that is an absolute masterclass in political framing.
Oh, the famous one. He says, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, they left me."
Think about the mechanics of that phrasing. If he says, "I changed my mind," he looks inconsistent.
He looks like a flip-flopper.
Right. But by saying, "they left me," he casts himself as the solid, immovable anchor of true American values.
While painting the Democratic Party as a ship that has wildly drifted off course into dangerous radical waters.
It's his Hollywood storytelling instinct applied directly to political ideology.
So armed with this potent new conservative ideology and decades of experience knowing exactly how to play to a camera, Reagan steps onto the electoral stage.
The source outlines his first major victory in 1966, running for governor of California.
And his platform is built entirely on individual freedom and shrinking the size of government.
And how does he connect with voters? He bypasses traditional political rallies and uses television speeches.
He looks directly into the lens and charms the electorate. He famously disarms his critics by saying actors are people too.
Which is brilliant. And he serves 2 successful terms as governor.
But his sights are set higher. The documentary notes he attempts a run for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976.
But he loses to the incumbent, Gerald Ford.
Right. However, Ford goes on to lose the general election to the Democrat, Jimmy Carter. Which brings us to the pivotal year of 1980.
The documentary paints the 1980 election as the absolute perfect storm for someone with Reagan's specific set of skills.
To understand why he won so massively, we have to look at the mechanics of the misery the country was experiencing at that time.
The 1970s in America were economically and psychologically devastating.
Exactly. The documentary highlights 2 major crises. First, the domestic economy was suffering from a phenomenon called stagflation.
Let's break that down because it's a crucial term.
Yeah, stagflation is a portmanteau of stagnation and inflation. Previously, economists thought this combination was practically impossible.
Usually, if inflation is high, the economy is booming and unemployment is low.
Right. And if the economy is stagnant and unemployment is high, prices usually drop. But in the late 70s, America had the worst of both worlds simultaneously.
You had soaring double-digit inflation.
Meaning the money in your wallet was losing its value incredibly fast. Gas prices were through the roof.
And that was paired with high unemployment and stagnant economic growth.
People felt like they were drowning financially, and there was just no life raft.
And that profound domestic anxiety was compounded by international humiliation.
The documentary focuses heavily here on the Iran hostage crisis.
In late 1979, militant Iranian students took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
And they held 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. And this wasn't some brief standoff.
No, they were held for 444 days.
Over 14 months. I mean, every single night, the evening news broadcasted images of blindfolded Americans and burning U.S. flags.
The documentary makes it clear that the public perception was that President Jimmy Carter was weak.
Weak, ineffective, and utterly incapable of projecting American strength abroad.
So you have a nation that feels poor, tired, and embarrassed. And Reagan recognized this profound national exhaustion.
He didn't just attack Carter's policies. He attacked the entire emotional tone of the Carter administration.
He hammered their record, calling it a legacy of vacillation, alienation, and neglect.
The contrast the documentary shows is staggering. Think about Jimmy Carter's communication style.
He was an engineer by trade.
Yeah. He gave these very clinical, somber speeches. He famously wore a cardigan sweater on television and told Americans they needed to turn down their thermostats.
And prepare for gasoline rationing.
He was essentially delivering the hard, depressing truth. Things are bad, our resources are limited, and we all have to sacrifice.
And then onto the stage walks Ronald Reagan, a 69-year-old former movie star with a warm, grandfatherly voice.
He doesn't offer lectures on sacrifice.
No, he offers a cinematic, sweeping vision of a shining city on a hill.
He tells Americans that their best days aren't behind them, that the economy can boom again, and that America should never apologize for its strength.
It was an absolute landslide. The documentary notes he won 44 out of 50 states and secured 489 electoral votes.
The Carter era of malaise was violently swept away, and the Reagan era began.
The documentary frames this not just as a Republican defeating a Democrat, but as a total triumph of messaging.
Reagan's plain-speaking, affable way was his superpower.
He could take incredibly complex, radical shifts in economic and foreign policy and explain them in a way that sounded like simple, undeniable, folksy common sense.
So he wins this massive mandate by promising a sunny, thriving America. But once you're actually sitting at the Resolute Desk, you can't just act out a thriving economy.
Right, you have to physically build it.
And his blueprint for that was so radical, we literally named it after him, Reaganomics.
But before he could fully implement Reaganomics, the documentary highlights a terrifying event that occurred just 2 months into his presidency.
Yeah.
An event which actually galvanized his political power. In March 1981, John Hinckley Jr. attempts to assassinate Reagan outside a hotel in Washington, D.C.
It was absolute chaos. Hinckley fired 6 shots in seconds.
He permanently paralyzed Press Secretary James Brady.
He wounded a police officer and a Secret Service agent. And one bullet ricocheted off the limousine and struck President Reagan in the chest.
It punctured his lung and caused massive internal bleeding. He was very, very close to dying.
But his survival, and specifically his humor during the ordeal,
Yeah, reportedly telling his wife, Nancy, honey, I forgot to duck.
and telling the surgeons, I hope you're all Republicans.
That humor cemented an almost mythical aura around him. The public saw him as physically resilient, which translated into political invincibility.
So riding this massive wave of sympathy and approval, he pushed his economic agenda through Congress.
Let's do a deep dive into the actual mechanics of Reaganomics, because the documentary describes it as a set of neoliberal reforms resting on 3 massive pillars.
Drastic tax cuts, sweeping deregulation, and free trade.
Now, to understand why this was so controversial, we need a functional analogy.
Okay, let's think of the American economy like a massive, sprawling garden.
I like that.
For decades, since FDR's New Deal, the dominant economic philosophy was Keynesian economics. The government believed its job was to actively water the individual plants.
Meaning the middle and lower class citizens?
Directly, yes. This meant high taxes on the wealthy to fund social programs, public works, and strong labor unions to ensure workers had money to spend.
Which would stimulate the economy from the bottom up.
Exactly. But Reaganomics completely flips the hose. This approach, which was heavily influenced by supply-side economics, argued that the government shouldn't water the small plants directly.
Instead, you dump a massive amount of water solely on the biggest, most deeply rooted trees in the garden.
The corporations, the investors, and the wealthiest citizens. You do this by drastically cutting their taxes.
And the theory often called trickle-down economics is that if the big trees thrive, they will drop seeds.
They'll expand their roots, hire more gardeners, and the economic runoff will naturally saturate the soil, eventually reaching the smallest plants at the bottom.
The source outlines the monumental scale of these tax cuts. The top marginal tax rate, the tax paid by the absolute highest earners on their top dollars, was slashed from 70% down to 28% over the course of his presidency.
And they paired this with massive deregulation, essentially removing the fences in the garden, arguing that government rules were choking the big tree's ability to grow.
Now, the documentary presents a very balanced view of the outcomes here.
On the success side, the filmmakers acknowledged that Reaganomics did break the back of the 1970s stagflation.
Inflation plummeted, and the economy did experience a prolonged period of GDP growth.
He fundamentally altered the global economic consensus. Leaders around the world started adopting variations of neoliberalism.
However, the documentary spends a significant amount of time analyzing the devastating systemic failures of this approach as well.
Because the central critique is that the water never actually trickled down. I want to look closely at the mechanics of deregulation, specifically because the source argues it led to disastrous consequences. It wasn't just abstract rule cutting. Let's look at the banking sector.
The documentary points to deregulation as the catalyst for banks running amok.
So how does that actually work?
It comes down to removing guardrails. Prior to this era, there were strict regulations on institutions like savings and loan associations or S&Ls.
They were boring, right?
Extremely boring. They took your deposits, paid a small interest rate, and used that money to give out safe, predictable home mortgages.
It was often called the 363 rule.
Yes. Pay 3% on deposits, charge 6% on mortgages, and be on the golf course by 3 p.m.
But deregulation changed the rules. It allowed these S&Ls to take federally insured money.
Meaning the taxpayers were on the hook if they failed.
Right. And invested in incredibly high-risk commercial real estate ventures.
So they were basically taking taxpayer-backed money to a casino.
And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big.
And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big.
And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when those high-risk bets went sour, they could lose big. And when the institutions collapsed.
This led to the massive savings and loan crisis, which cost American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out.
Deregulation, in that instance, didn't create freedom for the consumer. It created freedom for executives to gamble without consequences.
And that ties directly into the human cost outlined in the documentary. Because while taxes were being cut for the wealthy, the government was hemorrhaging revenue.
To offset those tax cuts and balance the budget, the Reagan administration took a machete to the social safety net.
And as a parent, I know the statistics the documentary presents here are incredibly heavy.
They are. The filmmakers state that $22 billion was slashed from social spending.
And we aren't talking about bureaucratic waste.
No, we are talking about programs that directly kept families afloat. Deep cuts were made to food stamps, Medicaid, and crucially, low-income housing subsidies.
This raises an important question. What happens when you abruptly remove the floor beneath the most vulnerable populations?
The documentary provides a staggering statistic. It directly attributes the rise of a massive homelessness crisis to these specific policy choices.
The source states that 1 million people became homeless during this era.
Cities saw pervasive urban decay because the federal funds that traditionally supported public housing and mental health facilities simply evaporated.
It's a profound paradox. Reagan campaigned brilliantly on the idea of getting the government off the backs of the people.
But the documentary argues that for the working class and the poor, getting the government out of the way meant actively destroying the safety net they relied on.
The filmmakers argue that policies marketed under the banner of individual freedom actually resulted in massive structural inequality,
making the United States the most unequal industrialized nation in the world.
So we have a situation where he is aggressively shrinking the role of government at home.
But what's truly fascinating is that while he was dismantling domestic agencies, he was doing the exact opposite abroad.
He was overseeing one of the largest peacetime expansions of government military power in human history to fight the Cold War.
Right, let's pivot to foreign policy, because the contrast is stark. To understand the stakes, we have to remember the psychological environment of the Cold War.
It was a 45-year geopolitical standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, defined by the omnipresent threat of total nuclear annihilation.
The documentary actually includes audio of those chilling 1950s duck and cover public service announcements.
Oh, those are terrifying.
I can't even fathom it as a parent. Sending your kids off to elementary school, knowing they are doing drills where they hide under their wooden desks in case a thermonuclear warhead detonates over their city.
The psychological weight of that hanging over an entire generation is just paralyzing.
And physically, Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain, symbolized most aggressively by the Berlin Wall.
Now, before Reagan, the prevailing strategy for multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, was containment, or détente.
Explain the mechanics of détente. What did that actually mean in practice?
Détente essentially meant a relaxing of tensions. It was an acknowledgement that both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over.
A concept called mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. So instead of trying to actively destroy the Soviet Union, the goal of détente was to manage the relationship.
Negotiate arms treaties, open up some trade, and avoid any direct military confrontation.
It was about coexistence.
But the documentary notes that Reagan violently rejected détente. He didn't want to coexist with the Soviet Union. He wanted to defeat them.
He famously labeled them the evil empire.
And his strategy to win wasn't a ground war. It was an economic siege. He wanted to force the Soviet Union to its knees by simply outspending them.
The mechanics of this arms race are crucial to understand. Reagan essentially opened the floodgates for the Pentagon, drastically increasing the U.S. defense budget to build new bombers, missiles, and his controversial Star Wars missile defense initiative.
But why did outspending them work? Why couldn't Soviet Union just match us?
Because of the fundamental structural differences in their economies, the United States had a massive, dynamic, capitalist economy.
We could generate immense wealth to fund the military while still producing cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods for citizens.
But the Soviet Union operated on a rigid command economy. The government dictated all production.
The documentary points out that the USSR was already spending an unsustainable 15% of its gross domestic product on its military, just to keep parity with the West.
So when Reagan doubles down, the Soviets are forced to try and match the spending, but they literally don't have the revenue.
To build more missiles, they have to siphon resources away from their domestic infrastructure.
They are starving their own economy. failing to provide basic goods to their citizens just to keep up the appearance of military parity.
Reagan recognized their economic fragility and exploited it ruthlessly.
Which brings us to a monumental turning point in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev takes power as the General Secretary of the Soviet Union.
And Gorbachev is a different kind of Soviet leader. He is a reformer.
He looks at the ledgers and realizes the Soviet economy is fundamentally broken. They are bleeding money subsidizing the Eastern Bloc and fighting this endless arms race.
The documentary highlights an incredible dynamic here. Reagan, the man who built his entire political identity on fierce anti-communism, finally finds a Soviet leader he believes he can actually do business with.
It leads to one of the most masterful pieces of political theater and genuine diplomacy of the 20th century.
In 1987, Reagan stands at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin.
And he delivers a speech that was reportedly opposed by many of his own advisors because they thought it was too provocative.
The documentary plays the audio. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It is absolute distilled storytelling on a massive geopolitical scale.
He uses a physical prop, the wall, to symbolize the moral failing of the entire Soviet system.
But the documentary is careful to note that it wasn't just theatrical rhetoric. That exact same year, Reagan and Gorbachev actually signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Or the INF Treaty.
The mechanics of this treaty are staggering. They didn't just agree to stop building new weapons, they agreed to actively destroy an entire class of existing nuclear missiles.
They implemented rigorous on-site inspections of each other's military bases. It was an unprecedented de-escalation.
And Reagan famously framed this new dynamic using a Russian proverb, Doverai, no prover trust, but verify.
What I find so compelling here is the paradox of his approach. The documentary argues that his incredibly hardline, terrifying rhetoric early in his presidency, the evil empire language, actually manufactured the leverage necessary to force the Soviets to the negotiating table.
Two men with diametrically opposed worldviews managed to sit down, recognize the catastrophic mathematical reality of their situation, and make the practical compromises required to walk the entire world back from the brink of apocalypse.
It is an undeniable triumph of global diplomacy.
But the documentary pivots sharply from this global victory to a profoundly dark chapter of domestic failure.
We transition from a president celebrated for his ability to communicate hope to an administration defined by its devastating silence.
Let's talk about the emergence of the AIDS epidemic.
As a journalist, examining how this crisis was handled is a tragic masterclass in how media framing and political ideology can fatally delay a scientific response.
The documentary sets the scene in the early 80s. Medical professionals start noticing alarming clusters of rare diseases.
Specifically Kaposi's sarcoma and a severe form of pneumonia.
Right. Appearing in previously healthy young men, predominantly in major cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York.
This was the emergence of the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, which causes AIDS.
And according to the source, the initial response from the United States government was essentially nothing. Total inaction.
Why? Because the filmmakers explained that the government and the broader public viewed it as a disease that only affected marginalized groups.
They looked at the initial victims, homosexual men, intravenous drug users, immigrants, and dismissed it.
It wasn't seen as a threat to the quote-unquote general population.
The documentary provides a very sharp comparative analysis to illustrate the political dynamics at play here. They compare Reagan's response in the U.S. to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's response in the U.K.
This is a fascinating comparison because politically, Reagan and Thatcher were incredibly close allies.
They were both staunch, right-wing conservatives who championed neoliberal economics and strong national defense.
Exactly. And both of them faced significant, aggressive pushback from the right-wing elements of their own political bases when this disease emerged.
However, the documentary notes a critical divergence in their governance.
When the science became clear that AIDS was a deadly transmissible virus, Thatcher's administration, despite facing uproar from conservative tabloids, implemented a highly pragmatic public health campaign.
They aggressively distributed information about contraception and safe sex to the public to curb the spread.
But Reagan's administration was paralyzed. The documentary argues that this paralysis was due to the specific makeup of his political coalition.
Reagan had courted and heavily relied upon the Christian right to win the presidency.
And the source describes this faction as having a much more puritanical view of morality.
The political trap is evident. The documentary asserts that Reagan was saddled with these elements of his base.
To aggressively address a sexually transmitted disease that was heavily associated with the gay community meant discussing topics like homosexuality and safe sex practices that his most ardent supporters viewed as moral failings or sins.
So his administration chose the path of least political resistance: silence.
The human cost of prioritizing political optics over public health was catastrophic.
It was.
From a media perspective, the documentary details how the disease was initially dubbed GRI, or gay-related immune deficiency.
By framing a viral pathogen as a gay disease, politicians and the press actively fueled a terrifying societal panic.
The source includes audio that is incredibly difficult to listen to. Activists and patients pleading not to be quarantined in leper colonies.
Stories of hospital staff refusing to bring food into the rooms of AIDS patients, police officers donning rubber gloves just to speak to people on the street.
In funeral homes refusing to embalm the bodies of the victims.
It is a horrific illustration of what happens when a medical crisis is weaponized as a moral failing.
The documentary argues that this initial silence and the accompanying prejudice allowed the virus to spread exponentially for years.
It wasn't until the disease began visibly affecting broader demographics and the death toll became impossible to ignore that the government finally mobilized significant funding for research and intervention.
It's a tragic testament to the very real lethal consequences of ideological inflexibility. Again, remembering that we are tracing the arguments laid out by the docu-real filmmakers here.
Which naturally brings us to the final act of this analysis. How do we tally the legacy of a presidency that is so fundamentally defined by these massive, jarring contradictions?
So what does this all mean? The documentary gives us some numbers to ground the conversation. When Ronald Reagan left the White House in January 1989, his approval rating was a solid 53%.
But the source notes that today he is viewed fondly by an overwhelming 75% of Americans. His posthumous reputation has only grown.
The filmmakers credit him with a permanent ideological realignment.
He didn't just win elections, he moved the entire Overton window, the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population, decisively to the right.
He revived conservatism from the ashes of the Nixon era and deeply ingrained a skepticism of federal government intervention into the American DNA.
But the documentary immediately demands that we balance that ideological victory with the tangible economic reality he left behind.
The source explicitly argues that his policies tripled the national debt, supercharged an era of vast income inequality, and decimated the social safety net,
leaving a pervasive crisis of homelessness that major American cities are still grappling with today.
Yet, sitting directly adjacent to that harsh domestic critique is his towering, almost unimaginable foreign policy legacy.
Just months after he left office, the Berlin Wall was breached.
The Soviet Union soon dissolved. The documentary credits his specific combination of economic pressure and theatrical diplomacy with helping to end the Cold War,
fundamentally altering the trajectory of human history and arguably saving millions of lives from the threat of nuclear war.
It's the ultimate historical paradox. The filmmakers paint a portrait of a man who was simultaneously an architect of unprecedented global peace and an architect of brutal domestic inequality.
But perhaps the most profound argument the documentary makes isn't about his policies at all. It's about how he permanently changed the mechanics of the office itself.
The overarching actor as president theme reaches its conclusion here.
Reagan proved that a celebrity, an entertainer whose primary skill was reciting lines and hitting marks on a soundstage, could completely conquer the highest, most complex office in the land.
The source argues that he fundamentally proved that the performance of leadership, the charm, the narrative control, the ability to make an audience feel safe, was just as important, if not vastly more important, than an intricate understanding of policy details.
He turned the presidency into a television production?
And the documentary explicitly states that his success built the framework and opened the gateway for future celebrity presidents, drawing a direct line to figures like Donald Trump.
He shifted the culture of politics. He understood that human beings are emotional creatures first and logical creatures second.
If you can control the narrative, you can control the country.
The documentary concludes with his post-presidency. He retires to California. And then, in 1994, he engages in one final, incredibly powerful act of public communication.
He publishes an open letter to the American people announcing that he has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
In doing so, he removed much of the stigma surrounding the illness and raised massive public awareness.
He slowly faded from public view as the disease progressed, eventually passing away in 2005.
The source notes the profound symbolism of his state funeral. Margaret Thatcher delivered a eulogy via video, and Mikhail Gorbachev, his former Cold War adversary, attended in person to pay his respects.
It was a closing chapter for a generation of monumental political figures. Let's pull all these threads together. Based on the arguments presented in the docu-reel transcript, we have traced an incredibly improbable arc.
We watched an impoverished kid from a rural town without running water learn how to read a room to survive.
We saw him use those instincts to climb the ranks of Hollywood B-movies, learning the mechanics of mass communication.
We examined how the paranoia of the HUAC era transformed a liberal union boss into a staunch anti-government conservative.
We dissected how he capitalized on the economic and psychological despair of the 1970s, using his cinematic optimism to win the presidency.
We broke down mechanics of Reaganomics, exploring how deregulation and tax cuts spurred growth but gutted the working class and created massive inequality.
We analyzed how his theatrical evil empire rhetoric actually created the leverage to dismantle the Soviet nuclear arsenal. And we confronted the tragic human cost of his administration's ideological paralysis during the AIDS epidemic.
The reason diving into these mechanics matters so deeply today is because this documentary explains the blueprint of our modern political reality.
Whether you view his legacy as a triumph of American values or a disaster for the working class, his methodology mastering mass media, relying on personal charisma over wonky details, and deploying simple, emotionally resonant narratives is the exact playbook utilized by almost every successful politician operating today.
He didn't just change the policies, he changed what we expect a president to actually be.
It forces us to look past the mythology and examine the actual machinery of power. We often want history to be a clean spreadsheet of facts.
But Reagan proved that reality is shaped by the people who know how to tell the most compelling story.
And that leaves us with a truly fascinating, perhaps slightly unsettling question for you to mull over as we wrap up.
The documentary makes a compelling case that Reagan's acting background was his ultimate weapon, opening the door for the celebrity politicians that followed.
So, as we navigate our current era of 24/7 news cycles, algorithm-driven social media, and absolute information overload, has the ability to tell a great story permanently replaced the ability to write great policy as the ultimate requirement for global leadership?
It's the defining crone of modern politics. Are we voting for the best architect, or are we voting for the best actor?
The script versus the messy, complicated reality. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time as we unpack another incredible story.